Okay, the Bible reading is from Genesis 10, verses 1 to 14. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The Japhethites, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Rodanites. From these, the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. The Hamites, the sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sabteka. The sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Resen, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is a great city. Egypt was the father of the Luddites, Anamites, Lehabites, Naphtuhites, Pathrusites, Casluhites, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorites. This is the word of the Lord.
Well done. Well, we have the first slide up there. Who do you think you are? Might be the title of a television program. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's been shown on SBS. And for those who are not familiar, in this particular program, various celebrities and would-be celebrities and once were celebrities are taken to places that have significance in their past, and different people jump out of the woodwork clutching various documents and different things relating to their history and explain different things that have happened in the past lifetime of these people and their ancestors. They usually burst into tears. Sometimes they meet relatives that they didn't know they had. And so you get a good, nice hour's television out of it. Today we are looking at genealogies. And again, thanks to Elise for struggling and finding a way through Genesis 10. It's a fascinating chapter, as you will, I'm sure, agree, having seen the first 14 verses of it. I started, as one normally does when you're going to prepare some sort of a sermon, I went and started to have a look at a few commentaries about this particular chapter and got a couple of quotes. Can we have the first one up there, Brett? Nick? Right, just hit the button. Yeah. It may very well be questioned whether a man should ever preach on a chapter such as this. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. We're going home. Now, that's what I call encouragement. Okay, well, we'll try again. Okay, can we have the next one? If I could choose one chapter from the Bible to take with me to a desert island, it would not be Genesis chapter 10. You think you're being told something? All right. Maybe third time lucky. Okay, if we're going to get third time lucky, a chapter that is surely one of the most interesting and important in the entire Word of God. Now, that's a bit more like it. Yeah, I feel a bit comfortable with this now. This is okay. But this chapter is about history. And history can be an extremely boring subject. It can also be a very controversial subject. And I have a feeling that I may say some things today that, from my particular perspectives of history, may not be the same as yours. And if that's the case, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anybody, but we'll have to beg to differ if we find that we're coming from different perspectives. It used to be said that if you put 3 accountants in a room, sorry accountants here present, that you will get 6 opinions. That was also then extended to economists, lawyers, and it certainly applies to historians. You can take the same facts of history and you can get so many different interpretations. So I thought what we might do to start with is just give you, if I can just give you a little bit of my own background, because I have done over the years a fair bit of digging into family histories and genealogy and assembled significant databases of people who, according to historical records, seem to have some connection with our family and so on. And I might be able to just shed a little bit of light before we get into Genesis itself, into what I was looking for in trying to delve into this information. I want to take you back to when I was probably 17, 18, that sort of age. Not that long after my mother died, my father took me to meet a relative I didn't even know we had, but she was visiting from Canada. I didn't even know where Canada was, other than a big blob on a map. And she wanted to meet us. So we went and had a good old English cup of tea and a cucumber sandwich with her. And while we were talking, she showed a picture. I have that picture up there. And that picture you might think looks a bit like me. Probably does, because it is actually a cousin that I discovered on that day that I didn't know I had. His name was Lloyd, and that's him in front of his house on Bowen Island, which is an island off the coast near Vancouver. Over the years, Lloyd's mother, that we met, sent us Christmas cards. My father died. We took over sending Christmas cards. She died, and her daughter sent us Christmas cards, and it just continued until 2008, if we can put the next picture up there. And there on the right of that picture is the same fellow, cousin Lloyd, the daughter of the person that we met, who continued the Christmas card correspondence, and her husband, Lloyd's son on the other side in the red top, and us. So in 2008, we actually got to meet family who had only been names on a piece of paper, people that we had never met. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. And we met a whole lot of new people through that series of what started a correspondence and then the visit to meet with them. And anyone who's really eagle-eyed could see that maybe between Lloyd's son and Eleanor is the house that Lloyd was standing in front of in the previous picture. So, all right. So things are starting to get interesting. We're discovering all these people. We're discovering our background. Can we have the next slide up? This is going to take us on a bit of a fun journey. If you can see some of the detail, you'll see there a Scotsman in a kilt. This is a model of a Scotsman in a kilt. And the reason it's a model of a Scotsman of a kilt is that that had a particular significance in 1800. Around about the time 1800, you weren't allowed, if you were in the City of London, you weren't allowed to sell snuff. It was illegal. But barbers used to hand over snuff to their clients in the barber's shop. And the reason people knew that the barber had snuff is that they had a model of a Scotsman in a kilt standing outside the shop. So that is actually an advert for snuff. It's a modern day equivalent. And the next picture of the street alongside it is where my great-great-great-grandfather had his barber's shop and he sold snuff. And he was a Scotsman. He was in the middle of the street where those people on a bike are, because the street was widened and his barber's shop has long since disappeared into history. But behind the trees over there and to the buildings on the right were two very significant buildings. Gray's Inn Court and Lincoln's Inn Court, the two primary centres of the legal profession in London. And they were his clients. They were the ones who went to his shop to have their hairs cut and to buy their snuff. And because of that, his son and grandson got positions in the law. Yeah, they were celebrating like Andy, that they had a job. And it was in the legal profession. And that nice row of buildings on the right at the top there was where they actually worked. And my great-grandfather worked as a legal clerk in a legal practice in that row of shops, which is very near the other one, near where that other street is, just a bit further down the road. So my family at that stage, middle to late 1800s in London, were well-established middle class. And then something happened, which you find when you do genealogy. Things don't always fit and go to plan. You like to think everything chugs along, families go along, and it all works out according to they all lived happily ever after. But it didn't, because the picture down in the bottom left-hand corner, by 1891, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother had separated. And we still don't know the reason why, because our family tree information doesn't tell us that information. But that's where my great-grandmother was living with my grandfather, who was the only unmarried son back in that time. My great-grandfather, we found out later through more research, was living in the Islington workhouse. There's nothing left of the workhouse these days apart from a small garden with a couple of the original walls, which is that bit in the middle there. And by 1915, when the workhouse was taken over to take prisoners of war from World War I, he was moved to a home, a newly opened home by the Peabody Foundation charity for homeless people. And there he stayed from 1915 until he died in 1922. So as we go into history, we start to uncover all this stuff. We find out all sorts of interesting facts. And the more we find out, the more we want to know. The whole thing becomes addictive. And you want to find out more about who all these people were. What happened to them? Why did some of these things happen? Why did a family break up? What happened to my great-grandfather's job in the legal profession? Did he cook the books? Did he have his, did he get drunk? Did he develop some illness that we don't know? Who knows? We don't know. But the intrigue is there. What does that say about my history? Does that in any way affect who I am today because of these things that happened in my past that are now starting to come to light? And today, with the modern techniques that are available, so much digitization of family history information, beginning the classical year in history for genealogists is 1837, when the centralisation of records of births, marriages and deaths started in England, followed by 10-year annual censuses from 1841. From then on, it became easier to track things down. But in the pre-digital age, Guy, can I just borrow you for a moment and get you to be my blackboard and hold this up? This is what you would have had to get. Now, this is the history of someone called John Tooth, who was a yeoman farmer in the countryside of Buckinghamshire, northwest of London, in 1720. Right down the bottom there, Eleanor Grace Tooth, my wife, married me, and Karen, this says at the bottom there, we had issue. Karen, so Karen's got a name check on the good morning issue. But you can see that just for one family over 300 years, just how convoluted that can become, right? And what that also says is, if that is one history of a family of farmers in the 1700s, what we're looking at in Genesis 5 and Genesis 10, those genealogies have got to be pretty truncated to take care of all this lot that happened in one family over 300 years. Thanks, Guy. Just put that to one side. If we just quickly put through the next couple of slides, this is just what's available now in terms of computerized investigation techniques, which takes all the hard work out of something like that. And put the next one too, Brett. That's the sort of family tree that now can be produced by just a few clicks on the button. Okay, now let's have our last slide, if we can, for this part of the message. Yeah, let's try and draw some of this together and start to apply this to the passages in Genesis that we want to look at. Because there's an overriding question here, and it's the one we started with. Who am I? Where did I come from? What has made me what I am today? And this was the question that was being asked. When Guy introduced this series to us on the book of Genesis some weeks ago now, he took us to the exiles by the rivers of Babylon, contemplating Jerusalem and life as it had been, and the need for those people to have reassurance of what their past had been, so that they could reconnect with their past and start to move forward, knowing who they were and what their identity was. And I'm sure many people go into genealogy these days with that question in mind. Who am I? Where have I come from? Maybe a sense that there are other people out there somewhere who are like me, who are connected with me in some way. There are people out there. Where might they be? Could I get in touch with them? Could I do what happened in my experience with that picture of meeting a cousin halfway around the other side of the world that I'd never met 50 years or so after first seeing his photograph. Genealogies are good for telling us who, where, when, for supplying dates, providing a framework of what our past looks like. We need to be a little careful, though, even with all the technology and computerized records, everything that's available today, it's very easy for that data to be inaccurate. Don't be persuaded that just because we've got a chart like that, or we've got a computerized record and everything, that it's all 100% accurate, because it isn't. Because it has all been generated off data that is extremely unreliable. The original censuses that were done in the 19th century were all handwritten, very nicely done in copper plate and all the rest of it. But copper plate writing on a census form is all very well. But if the person you're talking to can't actually spell his name, or doesn't know exactly when she was born or where she was born, at best, people take a guess and they, oh, I think I must have come from so-and-so because Auntie Nellie came from down there somewhere. So I think I must be from there somehow. And that was literally about the degree of accuracy that a lot of it had in the early days. All right. So it's a useful framework, but it's qualified. But what genealogy statements, family trees and so on do not do, of course, is tell us the how and the why things happen. And to do that, we need to delve deeper and look at other deeper aspects of history. Let's have a think now about the genealogies in Genesis. There are actually two, one in chapter 5, one in chapter 10. And they both basically fulfilled the same purpose, but they come at it from slightly different angles. Perhaps we can imagine those exiles back there in all those years ago, poring over these genealogies, trying to piece together their history, their collective identity, helping them to reclaim their religious, cultural, and ethnic identity in the face of the historical oppression that they had gone through, for example, from the Babylonians. There are, of course, other genealogies in the New Testament, but they're there for a slightly different purpose. They're but primarily there to establish the key question, who was Jesus and what was his line from David, which enabled him to be declared the Messiah, the Son of God. These genealogies in Genesis go right back to the very beginning. They are part of that narrative that goes right back to prehistory. So they need to be seen in that context. The family tree that is described in Genesis chapter 5, we didn't look at that one this time, but essentially that gives us the male line from Adam to Noah. Both these genealogies are the same in that they follow an all-male line. Every now and again, there is a reference that says someone had sons and daughters, but that's about as close as you'll get to any female references in these genealogies. It is all done on the male line. Genesis 5 traces the male line from Adam to Noah. The standout feature in that genealogy, and what throws a lot of people out when they look at that genealogy, is that this is where we find these references to people who lived incredibly long lives, Methuselah and his 969 years, and others of similar timelines that are very, very different to anything that we would understand today. I thought I might try and do a bit of a summary of all the discussion around that for you, but then I started to get into, opened a couple of pages of a couple of commentaries and thought, oh, this is all too hard. That coming back to what I said earlier about historians and their multiple opinions, I think you're going into considerable courses of study to try and unpick all the detail of Genesis 5 and what it all means and so on. So I'm going to take the coward's way out and skip over most of that and just make two observations regarding that. Firstly, yes, it is quite possible, it is plausible, and a case can be made for the fact in that period of prehistory before the flood that maybe man or humankind lived longer than they do today. I've seen rationales that try to explain that. Equally, you can also approach it from the other point of view and say, well, maybe their referencing to time was not the same as what we would today in our society, in our worldview, not what we would explain by time. So maybe 969 years might have been 969 of some particular time unit, but not necessarily a year as we would know it today. All those views are plausible. I don't have an answer. I can't say authoritatively which one it is, and I'm not even going to attempt it. There are some useful things that we can get out of it. There are some comments, for example, where people are described, he walked with God, and that's great, because that tells us, at least out of that genealogy, who the good guys were. But in the final analysis from us in our era, looking at that genealogy, my view would be simply, at the end of the day, whichever it was, does it really matter that much anyway to our faith today? It's the overall intent and purpose that matters. If it helped the people discover their identity and reconnect with their background, if it was a story or whether it was absolute 100% true fact, does it really matter? Is it worth spending a lot of time poring over it and trying to get our heads around it? I think the answer is probably, if it achieved its purpose and people found God through that and rediscovered their faith and so on, then great, job done, let's move on. The second genealogy in Genesis 10 is a different type of family tree, as we discovered when Elise was reading it for us. It's based on the formation of the various tribes and the spread of the tribes and cultural groups out from the earliest places, post the flood, out into the world, and the distribution of those tribes through the world. As with all genealogies, the same caveats have to apply in regard to the accuracy and completeness of the record. This passage, of course, would have been written many, many years after the actual events took place. And so it's quite plausible that some liberties and poetic license might have been taken in putting it together for the sake of a cohesive and readable story. So we need to have some caution again in whether we take all of this absolutely, literally to the letter. But the realistic view would seem to be that this is certainly a story based on as much fact as could be mustered at the time, but probably tailored to the specific task of explaining ancient history to newer generations. Three things stand out by way of comment on this. Firstly, of course, it was nothing new in Old Testament times to remind the Jews of their history at different stages in prophetic and other narratives. In the Psalms, in Isaiah and other places, there would be, for example, references back to the Exodus from Egypt and so on. So it was a normal thing for a Jewish audience or Jewish readership coming across these texts to be reminded of what had happened in the past, for the past history to be used to reinforce the truth of where things were today. So that was a quite normal thing. Second thing we need to understand is that whatever we may think about the actual story and the telling of the story, the spreading of humanity through the world, as described in Genesis 10, is actually pretty consistent with what modern DNA shows us about the way in which humans have moved out across the world from being originally in one relatively small space and moving north, south, east and west around the world. Some years ago, when DNA analysis first came out, and I'm not a great fan of using a lot of DNA in genealogy, simply because I think it can take you into places that you don't want to go. But I did do one exercise, which at that stage was only to be able to tell you what people groups you might have had some association with based on differences in DNA and different DNA patterns as people have moved out around the world and things have broken up and gone their own various ways. And guess what? It showed that I came from Northern Europe. Big deal. But equally, it does seem from the research that is available these days that the idea of a small grouping starting way back when, I'm not putting timelines on this one, but way back, and then people groups spreading out around the world, that this story is actually trying to put a simplified truth to all the complexities of that from an anthropological perspective in terms of the movement of people around the world. So whilst we may have some issues perhaps with the detail of the story, there is an underlying truth here, I think, that says God is our creator and God has moved his people, his creation, God has moved his creation out around the world. And that often links with concepts around the family of man, commonality of races and all this sort of thing. And it shows us something that is a very significant factor in our world today and has been right from the beginnings. And it shows us that right from the very beginnings, we have been a pretty tribalized lot. And we still are. And that can be on the very micro level of family, local community. It can be ethnically, it can be religiously, it can be politically. There is a tendency for people to want to stick together with a tribe that they are familiar with. Rabbitohs or dragons, Labour or Liberal, Protestant, Catholic, progressive, conservative. We tend to stick and gravitate towards those who perhaps see things in the same way that we do. For example, perhaps things have changed a little bit on this, but it's not that long ago that if you moved from one location to another and you were a Baptist, where did you look? The first thing you started to look for was another Baptist church. Because if you went from one Baptist church to another Baptist church, you would expect to find people who were roughly like you. And that was basically how we function. Yeah. Now, this is what I'm saying is not critical. It's not related to any particular group, but it is a fact that people do tend to gravitate towards their own. Now, if we accept that, where does that leave us when it comes to the command of Jesus that we love one another? We love our neighbour, because our neighbour may not be the same person from the same tribal group that we are. So there's an immediate challenge, isn't there, in terms of the way in which we apply the commandment of Jesus to love one another, to love our neighbour, and the fact that humanity does tend to set itself off in its little groups. And that raises questions for us, and I'm not going to try and answer those questions for us today, but I think it's a question that we have to put in front of us. Okay, what does that mean for our relationships with one another in community? What does it mean for our approaches to evangelism? How do we share the gospel with other people? How, recognizing that there's all these people that have spread out around the world, and as we know, some of them have heard the gospels, many of them haven't. How do we share the gospel with them when there is perhaps there may be resistance on the part of some people to even listening to what we want to say, because we don't come from the right tribal group to associate with them. Yeah. I said that this is one of these passages, and the reason it's important is because it throws up a lot of questions. It doesn't give us any easy answers, but it, by illustrating our common history, it raises questions, certainly in terms of how we relate to one another. We need to remember, though, genealogy only gives us the best view of certain facts. Genealogy itself, the passages we've read, are only a framework. They're neither complete nor correct. They don't nuance the history in any way with particular references to culture and so on that may need to be brought into the equation. One thing we can say, and we must say at this stage, just as those Jews sitting in Babylon thinking about their history, one thing that they couldn't do any more than we can do is change history. History has happened. We can't go back. They couldn't turn the clock back and say, all right, yeah, we want to go back to where we were before the Babylonians came, when we're now settled comfortably in Jerusalem, and we want to just go back and pretend that it all didn't happen. Because you can't do that any more than we can pretend that our history in some way didn't happen. Our history did happen, and we have to live with the consequences of our history. But history is complex and highly nuanced. It's impacted by so many different factors. So how we learn from it is something that we have to work out for ourselves, but at the same time realize that there are many challenges. What the genealogies in Genesis do was give the people a framework to rediscover their past, a way of understanding what God has done in their world and in their time. So how do we respond to the challenges? We have to learn from the history that we have come through. We hear many examples of it today. And there are many challenging views of history in our world today. Do we ignore much of the good work that has happened in our past to concentrate only on the wrong things that have been done. And there have been many wrong things done in the past. We can't avoid that. But do we whitewash or whatever, get rid of the good stuff and just focus on the bad? Or do we take a view that said, or at any time in history, yes, good things did happen, but okay, so did bad. Let's concentrate on doing better the things that were bad, but not throw out all the things that were good. I'm not sure that history is particularly well served by what I would sometimes call a sort of moral outrage, where we look at what's happened in the past. Oh, no, it couldn't. We can't live with that. That can't accept that. We need to be a little bit careful, I think, with history. Let me just give you a little an example, just as before we come to our conclusion this morning. I moved a flower pot out the back there this morning. That flower pot was standing on a foundation stone that was part of the second Ashfield Baptist Church that was occupied between 1906 and the 1930s, before this building. It refers to the first pastor of our Ashfield Baptist Church, the Reverend Fred Hibbard, who took office in 1874. And the plaque recognising the Reverend Hibbard was unveiled in the 1920s by Sir Hugh Dixon, who was a big industrialist from the late Victorian period of the late 1800s into the 1900s in Australia, in Sydney. He was one of the big noises in Sydney industry at that time. He had a big estate up the hill. And James, you will know the name of his estate. It's the Abergeldy estate. Yeah. That was Hugh Dixon's estate. And Hugh Dixon was a big noise in the Baptist Association, or the Baptist Union. Yeah. And there's a plaque unveiled by Hugh Dixon. And Hugh made his money from what we would call today big tobacco. Yeah. Our first Ashfield Baptist Church pastor was funded by big tobacco. Judge not that ye be not judged. And you can see the plaque as you go out to morning tea. All right, we're finished. What are we trying to achieve in response to this history? And we've wandered around a little bit. Two single things I think we just need to grab hold of. Firstly, the first lesson from this passage in Genesis, God is still our creator. God is still in control. This is still God's world. Humans are made to serve God, not the other way around. The world always was, is now, and always will be God's kingdom. There is no other form of sovereignty on earth but Almighty God. And secondly, as well as being a child of God's kingdom, we are all part of that brotherhood, sisterhood, siblinghood, whatever you want to call it, of humanity with a common creator. And that has implications for all our relationships with one another, with the people round about us in our local community and right out around the world? How do we do we play an effective part in bringing them all into a meaningful relationship with that Creator? May God help us understand his word this morning.